Welcome everybody who just joined us. If you guys can remember to go ahead and change your Zoom name. We'll ask that you have your first name, last name, comma, your company. So the way you do that is you hover over your name in the participant list, click more, and then scroll down to rename. And then should be able to update your name.
I think we can probably get started, Kim.
Okay, awesome. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And thank you all for being here today for the 8th meeting of the Building Performance Task Force. We'll just go ahead and dive right in. So thanks again for being here. I mentioned this, so if you're just joining or you haven't yet done this, please make sure you update your Zoom name. We'd like you to have your name and then your company, and that just helps us keep attendance as we start the meeting. So thank you all in advance for taking care of that. This is just a quick slide to review our task force schedule. We are at meeting number 8, which you'll see highlighted there in yellow. We have our 2 optional meetings remaining that we added after our last task force meeting. And so the next one coming up will be May 11th. The topic is TBD. We're probably will identify a couple of topics to dive into during that during today's meeting that we'll cover at that optional meeting. And then we'll have the 3rd optional meeting after task force meeting 9. The reason we wanted to show this again is because we have yet again pushed back our public engagement meetings, knowing that we want to come forward to the public with a full set of recommendations. We think that it would be most advantageous to host those in June when we have our draft recommendations closer to final. So we'll give you guys another update on that at our next meeting, but all to say for now, public meetings have been pushed out to June. And then we just want to cover the meeting norms for the day. So it's always helpful if you guys have your cameras on so we can see your faces, and then mute yourselves when you're not speaking. Remember that there aren't any bad ideas and that we're here to consider all ideas. So please feel free to speak freely. Share your thoughts and share this space with your fellow task force members. Be respectful of each other, be present. Leverage your expertise, not your position or your connections. Consider all viewpoints presented during our meeting. And again, to remind you guys of the new meeting norm that we added last time, we call this one ELMO, which is enough. Let's move on. And we'll employ this meeting norm to help us stay out of rabbit holes, very intricate discussions, and help us keep on track to achieve the objectives of our meeting. If we identify that there's a rabbit hole or a topic that we do need to dive into to flesh out in more detail, we will flag that to add to the agendas for those optional meetings that I mentioned we have coming up. And these slides you guys have seen 100 times now, but just wanted to remind everybody of the goals and outcomes of this process. You guys are here to make sure we're developing a building performance standard that is equitable, low carbon, and supports a clean energy future. Our overarching goal is to reduce sector-wide emissions 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. And then our hope is to develop recommendations that will reduce greenhouse gas pollution, lower energy costs, and help us improve air quality across the state. And the guiding goal statements, again, I'm just going to leave these here as a reminder for what you guys have already decided, the sort of principles that are guiding this effort. We have goals around equity, workforce, engaged and informed communities, reliability, cost, and streamlined process. So just good things to keep in mind as we continue through today's discussion as a good reminder for how we want to set these building performance standard recommendations. And again, we'll take just a quick look at the timeline as a reminder of where we are and where we're going. You'll see our timeline is there on the bottom of your screen. So our task force recommendations will be finalized in July. In October, those recommendations will go to the CEO, the governor, the General Assembly, and the AQCC. And then starting in June 1st of next year, those rules will go into effect. And then our first compliance deadline for the BPS is June 1st, 2027. So at our last meeting, we covered a number of different topics. The first and foremost was that we reviewed the policy tool that Group 14 developed for this process. This was emailed out to the task force. So you guys all should have a copy of this and able to edit and play around with it. We discussed different compliance options for the building performance standard, including looking at renewable energy, how we consider renewable energy, and how we consider beneficial electrification. And then we voted to recommend that the BPS use building property type specific site EUI targets. So we have a means of setting our targets, which is fantastic. Things that we talked about at our last meeting that we need to discuss further are how we're going to encourage partial or full electrification. How do we want to recommend that the BPS does that? How do we want to incorporate demand response or grid flexibility? Today, we're going to call that demand flexibility as sort of a catch-all for both of those terms into the BPS. And then how do we want to incorporate alternative compliance options for building owners into our BPS recommendations? This is a quick screen grab of that BPS policy tool that I mentioned that Group 14 put together. This was emailed again to you guys on April 13th. And this slide is just here to remind you that if you have any questions as you guys are playing around with this, to please let the Colorado Energy Office know, and feel free to email Kim and Crystal and they can help answer those questions. And as we go through meeting number 8 and continue on with these meetings, Group 14 will be updating inputs to this tool based on our conversations. So we've made a couple of really fantastic decisions as a group, and we have a few more to make. So the decisions that we've covered to date include deciding and finalizing on those guiding goals that we shared, using site EUI as a primary metric, and then using that metric, setting property type specific targets for the building performance standard. We recommended that partial renewable energy credit should be allowed to credit towards building performance standard compliance as long as those RECs are retired. And then we also recommended that electrification should be encouraged through the building performance standard. So today, the decisions that we have left to make are how do we want to, what are the mechanisms we want to employ to encourage electrification? What principles for demand flexibility should we consider for the building performance standard? And then what alternative compliance options for building owners should we include in our building performance standard? And so those decisions fall neatly into our agenda for the day. We're going to kick off the meeting with revisiting our renewable energy proposal, and we'll dive into this in just a bit. But there was a task force member who missed our last meeting who wants to lobby for a few changes to the proposal we voted on. So we'll start there, and our objective is to finalize that renewable energy proposal during our meeting today. Then we'll move on to beneficial electrification and demand flexibility. And these were the two topics that we covered in our optional meeting that happened in between meetings 7 and 8. And we got some really great feedback from the folks who were able to attend that optional meeting. So we'll share what we heard, and then we'll discuss, lobby, and vote on beneficial electrification and demand flexibility proposals to include in the BPS. Then we'll take a break. And after the break, we'll dive into alternative compliance options. We'll start by sharing what they are and how they're used in other BPSs. And then we'll cover a couple proposals that we developed on how we could consider using these in our building performance standard. And then we'll wrap up and send you on your way. So before we dive in, I do want to remind everybody, we shared these principles last time, but today we are going to continue using this process of lobby and vote for the decisions that we're going to be voting on. So just a quick reminder of how this works. So there's not a bullet for this on the slide, and I apologize, but we will share information we'll share our draft proposals with you guys, and then we'll have time to discuss. during that discussion, our goal is going to be to try and gain consensus with this group on the statement that we're going to vote on as a group. And so just like last time, we'll be live editing slides based on your guys' feedback. But to kick off the lobby and vote process, we'll share the final statement that we come up with from the discussion to vote on, and we'll conduct a vote. If we get 2/3 consensus, the vote will be a yes or no vote. If we get 2/3 consensus voting yes, then we will include that proposal as part of our BPS recommendation. If we have a majority vote yes, but it doesn't quite reach that 2/3 consensus threshold, then we have an opportunity to lobby. And how lobbying works is everyone who voted no will have 1 minute to lobby the group on what they would like to change about the proposal. And after that minute, we'll vote as a full group on whether or not we want to approve the change that was lobbied or deny the change that was lobbied for. We'll go through, so every person who voted no has a chance to lobby. And after each lobby, we'll vote individually on those lobbies. At the end, we'll have a final proposal with the lobby changes that were approved. And if needed, we can conduct a final vote on the original proposal with the lobby changes. And just a reminder, if we do end up lobbying and voting, I know last time we ended up gaining consensus, so this part wasn't necessary. But if we get there, remember to say it in a headline. You'll only have 1 minute if you are going to lobby the group to suggest the changes you want to see to the proposal. So with that, all of our reminder slides out of the way, I'm going to pass it off to Kim, and we're going to dive back into the renewable energy proposal to consider a couple of changes presented by one of our task force members.
Thanks, Kim. If you remember, and as Kim mentioned, we did have a vote on the renewable energy recommendation during the last meeting. And we did get in a little bit of a discussion between, I guess it was meeting 7 and this meeting, about whether we wanted to modify slightly that recommendation and that language. And so I wanted to turn it over to Katrina from Denver to talk a little bit about what they're thinking and what she's recommending that we vote on to change. Katrina?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. So you can see here the suggestions I made around modifications. I think the first one should be pretty straightforward for the group, that and this is all to align with how Denver's policy works. We want renewables to be local to the local grid, which just wasn't mentioned, but I think was implied in your last meeting. And we want the RECs to be retired in the year that they are generated, which actually I think was Colorado. Came out of our discussion, Kim, was really more even Colorado Energy Office's suggestion that we would agree with. I think I raised a discussion on Monday.com because the language you all settled on saying building owners must retain the RECs, at least in Denver and in Xcel Energy's territory, excludes a lot of forms of renewable energy, because I could share a slide that kind of goes through the programs that are available in our market, but the only way a building owner can build a community solar garden or install on-site solar is through programs Xcel Energy runs, where the building owner does not keep the RECs. Xcel Energy keeps the RECs. And so there's a lot of building owners. The city and county of Denver has built a lot of solar for ourselves. And we know lots of affordable housing providers, Denver Housing Authority, Mercy Housing, like just to name a few, have built a lot of solar. They've done a lot of this kind of early action, and they don't own the RECs for that solar because there is not a mechanism regulatorily available for us to build solar to reach our renewable goals and keep the RECs. And so what our ordinance says in Denver is that all solar counts towards compliance. I think that as a sort of backup option, we would at least like to make sure that there's an allowance, like this bullet says, for older systems to be counted. If a solar system was in service by 2023, and a building owner is sort of in good faith building solar to try to reach their climate goals, but didn't have the recs and didn't know this regulation was coming, that would count towards compliance. And we're still having internal conversations. This would be a change if we tried to line our Denver ordinance up with this. So I don't know that total alignment will be possible, but I think that if we had this allowance for older systems, we could work towards aligning our two ordinances, and a quarter of the buildings covered by this statewide ordinance or law are going to also be covered by Denver's ordinance. So I think alignment is one of our big goals. The only other thing I would flag is I'd really ask for a commitment if we were going this direction from the Colorado Energy Office and others that are part of this task force to work with us to make sure that the programs are created where we and other building owners can develop and build solar and keep the recs. We need options to build a community solar garden in Denver and keep the recs, because that's not possible today. And so when we are trying to reach our renewable goals, we just don't have good mechanisms. And so sort of like to suggest this bullet here as a place that I think is sort of a compromise place to land on recs, but also really ask that those who engage in those processes, like at the PUC, work with us to get good options that come with recs for Denver buildings, for other building owners. And I don't know outside of Excel territory how big of a challenge this is, but there's a pretty big challenge with rec ownership and local solar in Denver. Anything you want to add, Kim, or suggestions or questions from others?
Yeah, I can open it up for discussion. I don't know, Will, if you wanted to add anything or anyone else.
I think the only thing that I would add is that, from my perspective, I support this idea of allowing systems that were installed prior to the rules being adopted to count, even if they didn't retain the recs.
The other question I had that I'd love to hear from the task force on is that, and this complicates it a bit more, but the Denver ordinance gives credit for new capacity that is built. And so that means that you're subscribing to a program where Excel builds new, or you're building new solar or a new community solar garden. And so if we were to align with this, I think we would try to pivot to allowing subscriptions also, which make renewables an easier compliance option. And so I wonder if we're doing that, if we should also say that this is more of an alternate compliance option, where you have to do efficiency first, and then you can use renewables to fill the gap and reach your goal. Because this sort of, if we try to align, this pivots to allow sort of subscription to renewables in a way that our ordinance doesn't. And so to sort of hold true to what I think our original task force intended, if we sort of tried to align with this pivot, I would like to see this be more of an alternate option. I know we're going to talk about alternate options later today, but I would love to hear from the task force and Colorado Energy Office, because that's not here, but about the idea of moving renewables to be a way to fill a gap if you cannot get to your target with efficiency, not as a substitute for efficiency. I think that the intent of this legislation and our ordinance is really efficiency first. And because the solar was a harder option, we felt like it still pushed efficiency first. And this is easier because subscription renewables are allowed.
Hey, Katrina, I just have a really quick question for you, and I apologize to ask a question after you just asked a question of the group. But can you explain the importance of retiring the RECs within the year that they're generated?
I can try. Will and Kim might do better, but I believe that if you build a solar system, RECs are generated for that system every year over time. And so Excel, for example, I think has a big bank of recs that they have not been retiring. And that's because they're not sort of currently required to retire recs. They have to retire them in 2030. We're working to make sure they'll need to retire recs in every year on the way to their 2030 targets. And so it matters, like a solar system generates this big bank of recs over its 20-year life. What you want to make sure is that the recs are owned in that particular year and used in that particular year, not some sort of historical rec bank. Did I get that right, Kim? Will?
Awesome. Thank you, Katrina. Sorry, Will. Didn't mean to cut you off.
Nope, go on.
Karen, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I guess I just had a question because, we're in Xcel Energy territory, and the whole point of this is Xcel gets the RECs. Is it financially feasible to have somebody not get the incentives from Xcel, or do they have to get the RECs to do the interconnection or whatever? I was just trying to figure out, and maybe, we have another utility here that can answer that, but I'm just trying to figure out about the RECs. Is it good that they do it on their own outside of the utility?
I can try to answer for what happens in Xcel territory, and then maybe Joel wants to say, because I don't know how this works because we only have Xcel. Don't know how this works elsewhere in Colorado. But if you as a building owner want to build solar, there's on your building, if you want to install solar on your building, Xcel has two mechanisms to do that. So they always have to approve it. So they always have to approve the interconnection. You can do that through what they call net metering, which doesn't come with any incentives from Xcel. Or you can do that through their solar rewards program where they keep the RECs and it comes with incentives. The finances on that look much better if they keep the RECs because you get their incentive. So most people build solar through their solar rewards program, but you can build under net metering today. So this would just need to be a pivot and it's a big pivot. That's why I'm not certain we can make it yet. I can't commit to that at this point, right? But it would be a big pivot for Denver to pivot to every time we're building solar, and we build a lot of solar to try to reach our 100% renewable goal by 2025, to building under net metering and not under solar rewards. But there is a mechanism. Community solar gardens, there is no mechanism. You are only allowed to build a community solar garden under their community solar garden program, and Xcel keeps the RECs for all of those. So any building owners who subscribes to those, yeah, here's the graphic that I had put together to try to explain this. So those two community solar gardens and solar rewards sit on the right side of this graphic. And so we have built a lot of community solar gardens. We have built a lot of solar under solar rewards, as have other building owners in Denver, because it is a way to contribute in a real way to the climate crisis and solutions to it. It is the only mechanism we have today. But community solar gardens could exist under net metering. So that's what I'm asking for Colorado Energy Office and others who work in this space to work with us on. If we go this direction, we need a way to build solar gardens where we keep the RECs. We need to try to figure out the finances on this. Like, I don't want to stop all local solar development because of the direction of this task force, but I also understand we need, the state and the underlying legislation says we need to do things that are additional, right? And that we can't count grid cleaning. And so if Xcel keeps the RECs, it makes that challenging. So this was sort of our proposed compromise. But we allow all of this in Denver's ordinance. I will just say all 5 programs here currently would count towards, sorry, actually 4 of the programs count. The subscription doesn't. This month-to-month subscription in red on the left does not currently count under Denver's ordinance because it's not new capacity getting built. And so if we were going to allow that in, that's where I think we should also likely pivot to making renewables an alternate compliance option, because that's much easier than these other options where new capacity is getting built on a building or by Xcel.
Thanks, Katrina. And I just want to make sure I'm sharing some thoughts from the chat. So Stacy shared, we certainly want to support as best we can that the state in Denver or any other community with an existing rule is in alignment. So first bullet point, and I'll just go back to that slide, seems like a yes to me. The second, and this conversation of RECs is more complicated, and I do not see how you can avoid double counting if you allow a building owner to count solar on their building for which they sold the RECs. And if any other task force members would like to share their thoughts, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand. Nori, go for it.
Hi, yeah, thanks. This is complex, and I've had to do a little research to find out whether we do own the RECs or not on our solar gardens versus the solar arrays that are built on the affordable housing that we own and manage. And in looking just back through our files, it's both and. And so I think that for low-income housing tax credits and energy credits that are federal, we can use the solar that's built on site in order to generate, go for those energy credits that buys down the cost of the install up front. So we take that path, and then we also sign up for Xcel Energy Solar Rewards Community Program to buy more efficiency through the solar gardens. And so I love the fact that we can just get the cost of utilities down for low-income households by both mechanisms. And I just don't know what they're owning the RECs or not owning the RECs doesn't matter to me, even though it should as a member of this task force. But maybe that alternative compliance mechanism is the way to handle that, because the bottom line is we want folks to reduce and building owners to reduce their energy use, period. And there's just two ways to do it. And maybe the ownership of the RECs isn't as critical as we're making it out to be. Thanks.
Thanks, Nori. Joel.
So I think I agree to a certain extent with Nori. I think one of the problems I foresee is that in fact, not most building owners have the capacity to own and track their own RECs. I think I understand that Denver can do that, but for the average building owner, I don't think they're necessarily keeping a pool of RECs and banking them and monitoring and managing that process. On the utility side, unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with Xcel's programs, but generally speaking, utilities offer a green pricing program, often from wind, and the RECs generated from that can be sold to a customer. And then those RECs are retired on behalf of that customer, so the customer doesn't have to track the RECs and avoid double counting and so on and so forth. So I think that's why we recommended the allowance of retiring the RECs on behalf of the building owner. As far as on-site renewables, I don't think that RECs really apply in that situation. The customer is producing their own solar. They are using what they're generating to meet their own building's load. And it doesn't actually become a REC until it's sold back onto the grid through net metering. So to me, just as an aside, I think if you have on-site renewables, on-site solar, set the RECs aside. That should be 100% credit towards compliance. If you are purchasing RECs, whether through a community solar program or through a green power program like the wind programs out there, then maybe that's partial credit, and retirement should be eligible for that.
Thanks, Joel. Any comments or follow-up thoughts on the ideas that were just shared?
I wanted to give others time to speak, but just to respond to Joel's question, if you go back to that slide on Xcel's programs, the red program, Renewable Connect month-to-month subscription, is their new name for their wind source or green power program that you're referring to, Joel. I think it's changing names later this year. So yeah, that will be that sort of subscription option where the customer keeps the RECs. The real challenge is if you want to build your own over on the right-hand side, the customer doesn't get to keep the RECs for those today. And, I agree, Nori, that's been sort of what we settled on, is we don't care as much about RECs as like counting capacity. So we get to our 100% renewable goal through it at capacity accounting is our whole plan today. So that's why I said this would be a really big change for our own city buildings and our policy. We're really focused on getting more built and achieving capacity, but it is not then going to be additional, right? Excel will count it towards the clean energy plan.
Thanks, Katrina. And I just want to share quickly Kirk's comment or question in the chat. Not an expert here, and so apologies if this is not a relevant question to Rex. Does Excel offer a feed-in tariff or a mechanism for third-party ownership, power purchase agreements, etc.? Would these count as local Rex? I don't know if we have an expert on the call that wants to try and answer that.
I think I understand enough to answer, Kirk. I think that you would do a power purchase agreement to build solar on your own building. And so that falls under the solar rewards program. You could probably also do that under the net metering program through Excel, but it's not.
I
don't know if it's structured as a feed-in tariff. But you would participate to do a power purchase agreement. You would hire a solar provider and participate in solar rewards, most likely as a commercial building.
Okay, I was just trying to understand, like, as a building owner, how would I leverage this as an opportunity to comply with the program, and just trying to understand the complexities and what would be my options as a building owner to leverage RECs within the compliance. We do see like some building owners trying to lease their rooftops to someone to host a third party would actually pay for the installation, and then there would be some sort of a leasing agreement with the building owner. Sometimes those are through separate contract agreements, but not sure that maybe that's just a complicated outlier scenario. I was just trying to understand, like, how would I explain this to a building owner?
Yeah, I think that's not here because it doesn't fully exist yet, but Excel is working to develop virtual net metering, which I think is what you're referring to, and that may already exist in like your market, right? Virtual net metering would be where a building owner pays to build a solar garden and some other piece of land they own elsewhere, or maybe on even someone else's rooftop, right? And then they virtually net meter their building off of that solar garden that's built somewhere else.
Yeah, we're calling it shared energy systems, and we're promoting that to multifamily building owners within our territory.
I don't know how the RECs are going to work in that yet, so I didn't put it on the chart.
Question for you, Katrina. So you're thinking that the left ellipse, Renewable Connect, net metering, and Renewable Connect, can you make those work with the Denver program? Or was Renewable Connect kind of off limits for you?
So what you all proposed in the last meeting was to only count the programs on the left. I think that what was on the previous slide was to also allow legacy installations in the programs on the right to count, things built through 2023. I think we could align with that, but I am not, like, that's going to take more internal conversations before I could know for sure. And I would want to sort of also hear a commitment back to like enable that we would all work together to enable, community solar gardens to be possible under net metering. But it does have the disadvantage of, meaning if you go back to my slide, like that after 2023, only the programs on the left would be possible. Maybe we can make community solar gardens possible under those as well, but the economics on community solar gardens and on-site solar don't work as well without those programs on the right. And so this policy may end up driving a lot less community solar garden installation and local solar installation, and more subscriptions to Renewable Connect as it counts for compliance. And I just didn't, so it's a, I think it's something the task force may need to chew on a little bit more because it's complicated, right? There's some implications for all the building owners if we rule out the programs that come with good incentives, but where the utility keeps the recs on the right.
Thanks, Katrina. And so Karen and Kirk, I'll let you guys share your comments, and then we will move into sort of a place where we're gonna move to a vote. And so I'll move back to the next slide and kind of share what we are hearing from you guys and see if we're ready to take a vote on bullet 1 and 2. And if not, we'll flag that for further discussion. So Karen, I'll pass it to you first.
Okay, and I guess this is for Colorado Energy Office. Like Katrina's slide here shows that they're always developing new programs at the utilities, and we don't know what state legislation is going to come out. We've had some things, come out of the PUC that I sure didn't see coming. So I guess I just wanted to make sure whatever we do here is flexible enough so that if something else comes down the line, we're not locked in somewhere that these are the only ones that count, or whatever. I think we just need to consider that there could be more coming down before we get to our first threshold.
Thanks, Karen. And Kirk, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, Katrina. This is all really, I'm learning so much from you in this conversation. And I guess as I'm understanding this within these bubbles, the bubble on the right are really kind of tertiary, secondary impacts of what a BPS, these would be kind of secondary impacts within the community based on policies kind of pushed with the BPS. Having this as a part of the BPS program has this downstream impact to this. These are the downstream impacts that you've kind of identified. That's how I'm understanding this. And I've kind of keyed in on what you had said initially, which was how, like, if the driving force or the principles behind what this program is supposed to achieve is around trying to incentivize efficiency first, and promoting efficiency first, and having solar as being some sort of, even I think an alternative compliance pathway. That seemed to be kind of what you had mentioned briefly. I mean, am I understanding that, just before we go into that to the vote? I just hope that I'm kind of understanding the ecosystem here and what I'm weighing in on.
Thanks, Kirk. And Will, I wanted to call on you quickly if you also wanted to respond to the question that Karen had asked, thinking about how we want to keep this flexible and open moving forward.
So I don't think that there's anything in the recommendation that, is tied to any particular utility offering. But the principle that I think we're sort of grappling with is how to avoid double counting emissions reductions that are where the utility is also taking credit for those emissions reductions. So I think it would be flexible to new programs, but would still need to be able to address that double counting issue.
Thanks, Will. And then there's just a couple more comments that I'll read through the chat, and then I'm gonna move us into our voting stage. So from Stacy, CSU, Colorado State University, just entered into a PPA on 4.2 megawatts of solar access across about 21 sites, where we are in fact able to retain the RECs. Just an example of one. For everyone's information, some of the systems are in Fort Collins utility service area and some are in Excel service territory. And then Joel shared, I agree that utility-owned RECs should not qualify. If the utility retires the RECs on behalf of the customer, that should qualify. And then one last comment from Christine. Primary goal, no double counting. Other goals, support buildings that already put solar, trying to do the right thing. Efficiency first and solar second, and allowing community solar gardens and local if possible. Okay, Jenny, last thought from you.
Hey, I just have one clarifying question because I'm stuck on it too. So right now, currently, you ask Excel for help incentive-wise. They keep the RECs, correct? Yes. What incentive to that to go green to any building owner? I mean, yeah, you might need help up front, but downstream, Excel's still got those RECs, and you still did all that work. So how is that fair for that building owner at all? I mean, you needed help in the beginning, but Excel is still the monster who's got all that rec. I don't know. It's unfair. I'm with Katrina on this one. I have to be. I'm in Denver.
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so what we're going to go ahead and do now is vote on these two modifications that were suggested. And I want to remind everybody of the lobby and vote process. So we will move to our first one. And Katrina, quickly, do you have a question or thought or response?
Yeah, I was just wondering if I could add a third, because I think I saw support in the chat from Christine and from others here around structuring this to be efficiency first, renewables kind of to fill a gap to reach a target as an alternate compliance option, which it would be like a third bullet. And so I think I asked that question and saw a number of folks supporting that concept. So I was curious if we could add that in, or if anyone, is opposed to that, or I don't know if these need individual votes then, but.
Katrina, just one quick comment on that. I think that there are a lot of relatively recent buildings that are already high performing, for which actually the renewable path is a better path than increased efficiency. So I'm a little worried about codifying efficiency first, renewables second. I think on older, lower performing buildings, that's almost always the case, but I'm a little worried about putting it here. Just something to think about.
Okay. Will, I'll pass it to you.
I wanted to make sure before we vote that I understand the first bullet. And just to clarify, my interpretation of that bullet is that if you were buying offsite power through something like Renewable Connect, it would have to be, it's generated in Colorado and the RECs are retired on your behalf by the utility in the year generated. If you were net metering and you were retaining the RECs, that I don't think that we would be requiring individual building owners to figure out some way to actually retire RECs. They're just, if you retain the RECs, you're just retaining the RECs. I don't think any building owners are going to be out there somehow reselling RECs on the market. But I don't think they really have an easy mechanism for retiring them. So just wanted to clarify, that's my interpretation.
Will, in that case, do you think it makes sense to add here in the first bullet, RECs retired in the year generated and less net metered? Does that need to be specified?
Yeah, unless net metered and customer retains RECs.
Okay. Great.
Okay. And then as far as the third bullet, I was seeing general head nods from folks about including some statement around efficiency first. Paul, thanks for the comment that we weren't sure we want to keep it. We can include it here and add it as a vote to hear the task force thoughts. Kim, what do you think?
I'm going to say, let's vote on the first two, and for now at least, and then we could certainly talk a little bit more about the efficiency item or bring that over into the optional meeting.
Okay. Thanks. And then Joel.
Sorry, can we define local? Is that within state? How do we define local?
I'm going to ask that. Thanks for asking, Joel.
Let's say Colorado, state of Colorado.
We define local. I can find the language that we use in Denver. We say in the local utilities territory. So it actually has to be from your own local utility. This group could do differently, but that's how Denver has defined local in ordinance before.
Katrina, I think it says Colorado PUC territory.
I think in our ordinances that we use local utility. territory, but we could go double check.
And I just wanted to mention, because I think a lot of my wind source or whatever they're calling it now comes from like Wyoming border. So it makes sense to have it in a territory rather than in a state. If they're generating for Colorado in another state, like Wyoming.
Okay, well, let's oh, okay, I was just gonna say,
Yeah, are people
keeping
are okay
with
with then, I don't want to say Colorado PUC because not every utility is regulated by the PUC, but we can just say,
Within the
Yeah.
utility service territory?
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. So thanks for these modifications, everybody. And Julia and Crystal, if someone can make sure that those slides below are updated with the new statements to vote on, that would be fantastic. So we'll move us to we'll just make sure that that gets updated. Sorry, everyone, just making sure we've got everything lined up. Okay. Okay. So we're going to move forward with a vote. And let's see. So our statement that we'll be voting on first here, the task force recommends that RECs must be local, i.e. within the utility service territory, and RECs must be retired in the year generated unless net metered and customer retained, where the customer retains the RECs. So if everyone can cast their votes, and Crystal, can you remind me how many voting members we have here today?
I'm actually asking Lotus that right now, so.
Oh, great. Okay, let's check in on that. One, two, three, four, five. Looks like 16.
Yeah, as of right now, we have 14 and now 15. Okay, we now have 16 votes.
Okay.
If there's a task member who did not get a chance to vote, just please message us so that we can include your vote.
Okay. Fantastic. And so we had 100% of our voting task force members vote yes to include this as a consideration or in addition to our renewable energy proposal. So thank you everyone for that vote. We won't do any lobby changes since we didn't get a no vote here. And then our second vote is just making sure we have it right. So we're going to move forward with voting on the second bullet. The second bullet on that slide stated, oh, and I'm sorry, Christina, I want to make sure I'm catching your comment here. Within a utility service territory is fairly narrow for a rural building in a co-op territory.
I don't know, maybe Joel has a response to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I see Christine's point. For example, a co-op might have a narrow territory surrounding a city, maybe a mile outside of it. And maybe the best land for solar for a community solar garden falls just outside of that and would technically not be within the service territory. I could see Christine's point that maybe that would not be allowed under what we just voted on.
Can I just ask Joel, does that mean that that utility, the co-op, is not accessing the power generated by that solar? I understand service territory, but the generation is is in the territory.
Yeah, so the generation would be fed into the service territory, but you could make that same type of argument for something out of state too, so long as transmission reaches the territory, right? So there's a little bit of gray area there I think we hope to avoid. As far as the RECs are concerned, once they're generated, that becomes part of the utility account. The utility either retires them on behalf of the customer, allocates them to the customer who owns them, or the utility retains them. And that was kind of the three scenarios I think we talked about a moment ago.
Christine mentions maybe doing either modifying that statement to saying either within state of Colorado or the utility territory. And then Stacy notes that perhaps this is something that can be moved offline, since it seems that we all agree on the intent.
Okay, fantastic. So I think we'll highlight this. We'll note that this is something that we just want to make sure we're thinking about how that local is defined. But what we can take away from that vote is that the intent is that behind the RECs is that they are at least within the state of Colorado, ideally within or near to the service territory of the utility.
Question, please. This one individual that's making everybody a little bit iffy on location. I mean, chances of you putting or anybody installing a solar array on the border of Colorado and Wyoming aren't likely. I mean, you're not just, it might be good land, might be good sun, however, location wise doesn't make sense. So if you're talking strictly solar, take that in mind. However, if you're talking wind power or a new set of windmills out there, then maybe change your wording. But chances of you sticking a solar array big enough to do any use on the border of Colorado, Wyoming, or any other of our other three borders is just, I mean, location wise makes no sense as an install.
Great. Thanks for that, Jenny. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second vote here. So the statement that we'll be asking you guys to vote on, the task force recommends that the AQCC allow renewable legacy systems that are in service by 2023. And again, we're looking for 16 votes from task force members. Okay, and we're missing, okay, fantastic. And here are the results. So 94% said yes. Christine shared yes if on site, question mark. And again, I think any of these sort of follow-up questions, let's pull those into the notes and we'll discuss those offline since we do have a lot to move through today. So I'm going to keep us going. So thanks everyone for that vote. We will consider that consensus that the task force would like to recommend that the AQCC allow renewable legacy systems to count that are in service by 2023. As we move into the next section, I just want to quickly remind everybody of a couple of our meeting norms. Say it in a headline. We do have limited time today, so try to keep your statements concise. And then Elmo, again, if we think we're kind of diving into a rabbit hole, let's identify that and decide to move that to a discussion for another time. So I'm going to move us now to beneficial electrification. And Kim, I'll pass it off to you to review what we discussed in the optional meeting.
Great, thank you, Kim. What is in bold is the statement that the task force had voted on last time and approved. And during the optional meeting, we dug into that a little bit more. We got some more suggestions, which we tried to capture in the bullets below. So we wanted to have a short discussion on some of these changes, making sure that we incorporated what we heard from that optional meeting and kind of narrow them down and have a vote on some of these. Again, they're fairly broad statements. They're not requiring electrification, but it is more about encouraging and providing either, full compliance or fractional credit to building owners that can document that they have electrified their space heating and domestic water heating system loads. So wanted to go through these. You can all read them, but essentially, we talked about removing that end of life clause. There's still a question about whether or not we should include cooking equipment. And then we were talking a little bit more about how to incorporate fractional credit since full electrification can be challenging for folks. So wanted to open it up for some discussion on these statements.
I would jump in and just say, I think allowing fractional credit makes a lot of sense, since the emissions reductions come, even if you're still a mixed fuel building, and there may be many cases where it makes sense to retain the gas as backup for very cold weather. So I think we should definitely, or I would support allowing that fractional credit.
And I did want to mention, because I attended that we talked about what was reasonable for, you get to a certain point, you can't get 90% if you're using backup. You can't, that's not going to happen. So the 50 to 75 was the wisdom of the folks who know this stuff on where you could actually get to.
Thanks, Karen. Christine?
The state legislation going through now that'll give a 10% tax credit for heat pump and heat pump water heaters says 80% of the load.
Yeah, and we just talked about that one too, and we that's why 75 was in. We didn't want to do the absolute max, so all of that came up in our discussion. So I just wanted to get that out on the table, that the 75% was, because of that 80%.
The state is saying that's a minimum. The electrification would have to cover at least 80% of the load. So if someone does 50 to 75%, they would not qualify for the 10% tax credit, which maybe is fine. That's their choice. But another part of me says consistency is nice to say 80%. And I'm also curious, because I'm sorry, I missed the meeting. Is this for an alternate compliance path? I was thinking it was. And if so, are you saying that if someone electrifies 50% of their load, they meet the compliance for the 2026 period? I would think it should be more substantial than that, like at least 80% if you're saying that that alone meets the compliance target, and maybe partial credit for partial electrification below 80%.
Thanks, Christine. Any thoughts on the 80% threshold brought up by Christine, and if there's an agreement to keep that threshold consistent or to encourage electrification at a lower threshold, even if it's possible?
Yeah, and I just asked that we go back and look at some of those notes that you guys posted, because this was a good discussion. And I know 80% did not make sense for this program. So consistency is always great, but there was a lot of discussion, and I'm sorry, I can't recall everything, but it just made more sense to go down from there. So I just asked that we review those meeting notes.
Thanks. Yeah, I read through them. 80% I would consider almost full, because it allows you to meet all your primary bulk of all your loads through electric, and still allow gas backup if need be, because we are talking about existing buildings. But I don't really think lower than that should get you should be all you would have to do for compliance for a compliance period.
And I'll just say, we talked about not all building owners or buildings being equal. So this was definitely trying to hit a sweet spot.
That's why it's one of several compliance paths, right? This compliance path doesn't have to be available or applicable to every single building because it's just one of several compliance paths, right?
Is to your point, Christine, is that why the phrase allow fractional credit? So if you did 75, it didn't get you full, but it got you partial, and then you still had to do something else?
Yeah.
So I think just to add to Karen's point, I think part of the discussion around in the optional meeting was thinking that in order to encourage electrification, it might not be a one swoop, everything is electrified, but rather one system might be electrified, or this piece might go and then this piece might go. And so I think the intent with that lower threshold was to encourage electrification by way of allowing maybe fractional credit for those building owners who can only take on space heating or water heating, for example, and not do it all at once.
Can I ask two questions? One, do we mean that this would be additional credit on top of the EUI savings someone gets from electrifying? Or are we just trying to guarantee that if you electrify, your target is adjusted in a certain, is it a target adjustment or is it additional savings credit, I guess? And then also, should we provide some higher level guidance to the AQCC around the credit should be proportional to the savings one would expect from these projects? Because, you know, what does fractional mean, or when should full be given? Like, should be, just you're trying. I think the task force is trying to sort of guarantee that you'll get there if you electrify. So, a couple questions.
Yeah, I kind of think that was the intent in case there was a situation whereby the EUI did not drop as expected or something, or to encourage electrification. So I think there was some of that intent behind that. So, a building owner would know. Again, we're not sure exactly how the AQCC will calculate this in the rules, but we wanted to kind of make it broad enough so that we could provide that guidance to the AQCC that we think this is an important policy, and in order to encourage it, we would recommend, or the task force would recommend, allowing some kind of credit towards electrifying these loads.
And Katrina, to your first question, I think we wouldn't be talking about adjusting a target, but rather additional credit on top of efficiency to earn the target that you already have set. So Stacy, I'm going to pass it to you, and then Kara next.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I just want to make the comment about that again. I'm thinking this beneficial electrification consideration was around encouraging or making sure we do not disincentivize people from getting on the pathway to electrification. I'm wildly confused by the idea of partial credit. I don't even know what that means. If we're measuring performance based on EUI, I don't know what fractional credit is actually referring to, but I know I want to encourage building owners to get on the path of electrification. And there was concern that some initial steps may in fact increase a person's emissions or EUI. But if that was an initial phase one, step one, smart long-term step, that we do not want to disincentivize a building owner from taking that step if we know that ultimately it gets us and them to their goal.
Thanks, Stacy. And I just want to follow up with a question. Do you have a suggestion based on that intent on how we could adjust? I'm looking at bullet 3 right now, how that could be adjusted to take that into account? Yeah,
I mean, bullet 3 is getting the closest, right? And that's I I like what's happening in that bullet, but you're right, there might need to be a few extra words. I'll think about it here.
Sounds good. Thanks. Kara, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think that's where I was going to go, is to provide a suggestion there. And I guess just before I go there, stepping back on one of the things that I took away from the tool, the great tool that that you guys have developed for this process, is that the grid decarbonization is going to take, it's a big hammer. And really our next biggest hammer is electrification. So I guess it became very clear to me how important of a strategy this is towards achieving our long-term goals. And so I would propose maybe bullet 2.5 or a new bullet 3 would first be that full compliance with the targets is granted if you achieve 80% electrification. If we're going to grant full compliance and ask people just to electrify and give them full credit towards the targets, then I think it should be something aggressive along the lines of 80%. And I think based on the analysis that I've seen done, I think that's achievable. I don't, I'd love other opinions on the engineering part of it, but I don't have great heartache with the 80%. And then I guess if we were to keep the rest, the new bullet point 4 there, I'm wondering if we're going to get sufficient value out of the complexity that we're allowing by having partial credit. I don't want to turn away any kind of electrification, so I want to encourage all of the above, but I'm just wondering if it'll be worth the complexity of defining partial credit. Thanks.
Thanks, Kara. And just a couple of things from the chat. Kirk thanks you and likes that suggestion for simplicity. Christine suggested the same and suggested we achieve 80% electrification. Maybe Christine, this with high efficiency electric equipment. Is that what you're suggesting to add there?
Yeah, I was trying to get my words to come out of Bill Green's voice, because he's told us, I don't know how many times, about electric resistance and that we don't want to encourage that. Right, Bill? Did I say that right?
Yes,
Yeah,
I will speak for Bill.
The problem, I think the problem could be that, and we're seeing this with the buildings that we study, that the utility can't provide the power, that there's only limited power available. So, I think we should allow partial credit, because that may be all the building can do, or it may be all they can afford right now. So, and high efficiency is good, but the system has to be appropriate for the application. Not all heat pumps are appropriate for the application. So.
Thanks, Bill. And just to add to your comment, Stacy shared, I'm not sure we need to find a way to give fractional credit, but we should be able to define what we will not penalize a building owner for, that we will not penalize a building owner for taking strides towards electrification. And Jenny shared, at the point of complete electrification of a building, the owner must have the available capacity in their electric service load. We could end up making a building do a service change to handle the new load. So I'm hearing from the group that we like current bullet 3. And right now what we're grappling with is how, if we want to allow for fractional credit, and if so, how we define that. Christine. You're muted, Christine.
Sorry, about the electric service load. I don't think we need every path to be available to every building. And I don't think we can let a minority of buildings throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that makes sense. And I agree, we should figure out something for partial credit. And I think we're just noodling on exactly how that would be done. But it sounds like we're all okay with the concept. We've just got to hear exactly how we would calculate that.
Thanks, Christine. Kathy?
I actually, Christine just took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say that we need to figure out some sort of a partial credit, because we want to encourage, as Stacy said earlier and Bill did, we want to encourage buildings to move toward electrification. I think if many of our members saw just the 80% in here, they'd move on, because they either can't afford to do all of that all at once. And I think we need to figure out a way to encourage them to start down this path. And if that means we need to spend more time noodling out exactly what that means, if you get.
Oh, Kathy, I think you muted yourself. I don't know if we heard the rest of your sentence there.
Oops. Sorry. Yeah. Lots of stuff going on. Sorry about it being the last 2 weeks of the legislature, but yeah, I don't know where I muted myself at, but I think we need to figure out how we encourage our building owners to start down this path. And even if they can only do 50% in the first year, figure out how to give them some kind of a, do they get, if they electrify 50%, do they get 50% credit towards what their target is, or something like that? But let's figure that out and encourage them down this path without making it such a large leap that they can't do it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Katrina, pass it to you.
I like the direction the discussion is going in terms of that third bullet. I wonder if we really need credit for partial electrification, because electrification with heat pumps should help so much with reaching EUI targets. So our studies are showing that if you just electrify rooftop units, furnaces, some of the simpler, easier to electrify buildings, then you should see a 24 to 30% EUI reduction. Electrifying water heat can reduce, with this heat pump, can reduce EUI by 15%. So these are already going to be big strategies to reach the EUI targets. And so I'm trying to think of like how partial credit like layers with the EUI benefit they are already getting from installing heat pumps. For example, one project we're working on where the Forum Apartments owned by Colorado Coalition for the Homeless have gone off of the steam system and are moving to heat pumps. They're going to see a 45% EUI reduction. That's their single biggest strategy to comply with the Energized Denver ordinance. And that is full electrification in that building. But I wonder if we need anything else, like, or how fractional credit would work. I'm happy to join a side conversation on that. I don't quite understand how it would work, or why, or if we need it.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. So I think I'll offer it up to final comments, and then I think what we'll try to do here is vote on a couple of these bullets. So the ones that I think would like to get a vote on from folks is with the original statement that we voted on and improved in meeting 7, removing the statement at end of life here, so we can keep this high level statement that we want to recommend that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel space and water heating equipment without the end of life component. So if folks want to electrify in advance of the end of life of those systems, they can do so. We also, I believe, and this will come a little later, we'll show this slide, but this, just to clarify here, we also wanted to add domestic hot water as a clarifying statement within this first one. So we can hot water, and then the idea would be we remove this piece. So we'll vote on that. Then I think we'll move to a vote on this bullet number 3 here. Granting full compliance with targets is granted if you achieve 80% electrification. And I want to specify before we vote, since we are a very detail oriented group, we are talking about 80% of the load of the building, right, versus 80% of systems. So let's just add that clarifying statement.
Is that space and water heating load?
I think we would say, okay, space and water heating load.
Yeah, that does need to be clarified. Thank you, Katrina.
Okay. And then for our last statement, I think we should do some level of vote with this. I am curious from our CEO team, do we want to vote maybe on the intent around providing fractional credit? And then take this offline for further discussion in the optional meeting?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can vote on the intent, or just, it seems like we have the intent, but maybe we just need to vote on the first two, and then we can noodle on that language a little bit more.
Okay, that sounds great. So let's move on to the first vote here. And I just want to add here, domestic hot water heating, to make sure we have that language written in. So beneficial electrification vote number 1. Task force recommends that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel space and domestic hot water heating equipment with efficient electric technologies. If everyone can cast their vote. And Paul left us, so we're looking for 15 total votes for this.
Hey, Kimberly, as we're tallying the votes on this one, I'm wondering, like, if, and this is a procedural question, if there is differentiation between we're just recommending that they consider this stuff, or we're recommending that the AQCC actually creates an alternative compliance path to this effect. Are those differentiated?
That's a great question. I think Kim, do you want to take a stab at answering that?
Yeah, I think we were trying to, we weren't trying to necessarily say it's an alternate compliance path, but it's because we're talking about that during the next section, and that's really more about adjusting timelines or targets or things like that. So we kind of consider this one of the, a main compliance path, if you will. Ultimately, we think that going this route would reduce site EUI, but if for some reason it doesn't, then this is one way to comply. And then Kathy had a question about end of life. We just wanted to broaden it. So why we took out that clause was really just that the AQCC could encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel space and domestic hot water heating equipment whenever it's right for that building owner. They might want to do it prior to the end of life for the system. So that's why I think we decided to take that out.
Thanks, Kim. And I do want to just, for folks who missed the optional meeting, we started in that optional meeting with discussing the statement that was already voted on by the task force, and these recommended changes came up. So we wanted to just make sure we captured those changes that were brought up in the optional meeting, and we're voting to fix or kind of update this original statement that was voted on to make sure it's reflective of sort of these considerations that we heard from task force members. Like, you're sharing the results. So we got an 88% vote to include this as a consideration in our building performance standard. So thank you everyone for that vote. We're going to move on now to voting on the suggestion from Christine and others that the AQCC grant full compliance with the targets if you achieve 80% electrification of space and water heating loads with high efficiency electric equipment. And
one comment really quick, sorry, Kim, is Kirk has in the chat, to clarify, the fractional credit is only available during the first target in 2026, but not a compliance pathway thereafter after 2026. And to be in compliance with the 2030 target, in 80% electrification must be met. So this kind of hits on both of the next two votes. I'm not sure if we need to add any text there to clarify.
Yeah, that's a good point about this one. I think we missed putting in something about 2026, that first target. And I don't know if we're ready to vote on the partial one yet. We could. The task force thinks we should.
We can vote on the intent.
The intent, okay.
Yeah, and I liked, Christine, how that intent was framed in your comment. I saw, where was it? I'm lost in all the comments now. Partial electrification equals partial credit. Kathy?
Yeah, just a question. Help me understand why this would only affect the 2026 targets. Let's say it's not something you could do for the 2026 target, but maybe you can build it into your plans to be 80% electric by the next target. Why would that not get you, I guess, why just this first target?
I thought
yeah.
Kirk's point was that a partial credit would only count for the 2026 target, but full electrification with a goal of full electrification by 2030, right, Kirk?
It was in relation to the, and sorry, this is after the fact, but the next slide, I think it was related to the conversation that we were having around the partial credit, because the next bullet does specifically cite 2026. Our 80% electrification conversation did not address any of the target. My assumption was all these targets were going to be, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of 2026 and 2030. I was just thinking about in any compliance cycle, but one potential compromise was to think about partial within the first target and going a little bit more aggressive to hit the 2030 target.
And so yes, for the purposes of this specific proposal that we'd be voting on, if you guys think that 80% electrification should comply with 2030 targets, I see and I'm not sure that I understand if the task force wants that to be compliant with the final target. Christine, I'm nodding, seeing a head nod, so I'll just finish my thought quickly. If someone achieves that ahead of the 2030 target, then I think in time for the 2026 target, we would also likely grant compliance for that target as well as them, as far as we can, understanding the intent that the task force is trying to bring to this and vote on these proposals, even if they are brought forward on the floor. I think our idea behind developing straw proposals was knowing that you guys would change them. And that was kind of our hope, right? To see those be adjusted with your guys' input and then voted on within the meeting. So definitely we hear you and we'll make sure that we're thinking through that process and making sure you guys have an opportunity to provide more strategic edits on these things that we're voting on as we move forward. Okay, so I see 14 votes are in. For the folks who haven't voted, we have two, or I guess one more vote, one more voting member.
I closed the vote.
Oh,
so if
sorry.
there is someone who did not vote, please put it in the chat or email it to us.
Awesome. Okay, so it looks like we have consensus to move forward with this proposal. So thank you everyone for your vote. And then the final thing we'll vote on here is this top statement that we've included on the slide. So we're voting here around the intent to allow partial credit for partial electrification. And I want to clarify before we launch this vote, does the task force want to specify that this is for 2026 only, or can this also apply to the 2030 targets as well?
I go either way.
Maybe we just keep the intent broad for now.
Okay.
And
sounds good. Okay. All right. Well, Crystal, then if you don't mind launching our next poll around allowing partial electrification for partial credit, and then we will take this discussion offline in one of our optional meetings to flesh out the detail.
We didn't have this vote planned, so just give me 1 second.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, give us a quick moment as we pull this into a Zoom vote poll to share with you guys. And thanks to the CEO Lotus team who's doing all of the navigating of all this text behind the scenes. You guys are making this go seamlessly.
And just wanted to note, Christine, we see your comment there in the chat regarding an idea for the partial electrification. So we'll make sure that's added to the notes and gets included in that discussion in the optional meeting.
Okay. And after we launch the vote and have everybody vote, we will move into a break. So I realize we're shifting around our agenda a bit. Those early discussions were fantastic and we wanted to make sure we had time for them. So we'll be shifting the agenda back. So after we launch this vote, we'll give you guys a break and ask you all to come back at just after 2:40 so we can reconvene and continue our discussion. And I see Crystal working furiously over there to get the poll ready to launch. So thank you so much, Crystal.
Apologies, Zoom has a max of 25 polls. And so that's what I'm working with right now. So just give me 1 second and I will launch it. Let me know if the wording is incorrect though. This is what I have. Is this correct, Lotus team? Or was there something else I had to include?
Nope, that is perfect. Thanks, Crystal. Okay, everybody, please cast your votes.
And it's just 15, right? Not 16?
That's correct. Okay. So it seems like we are, majority is in agreement that partial electrification should equal partial credit. So that's fantastic. We will take this question of how we formulate what that looks like to our optional meeting. And with that, I will let you all go to a break. Thank you so much for the fantastic discussion and deliberating so far. Please make your way back to your computers by 2:42 and we'll continue. Okay, everyone, if you can hear my voice, we have 1 minute till we're going to get started again. So make your ways back to your computers. Please turn on your cameras and mute yourselves, and we will get going promptly at 2:42. All right. Please make your way back to your computers, everybody. And we'll go ahead and dive in here in just another moment. And with that, it is 2:42. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the second half of our meeting. So thank you all again for your contributions and the discussion around the renewable energy pathways and the beneficial electrification compliance options. What we're going to look at next is a topic that was discussed at length in our optional meeting, and it will be the first time the full task force will be sharing or that we will be sharing some of these ideas with the full task force. So hopefully those who weren't able to attend the optional meeting had a chance to review the meeting minutes. And Kim Burke, I'm going to pass it off to you to introduce us to demand flexibility.
Yeah, thanks. So we did, since we didn't have time during the last full meeting, we did kind of dive into this a little bit more during the optional meeting. And really, I think what we heard from the task force during that optional meeting is that we can maybe agree on the broad principles of recommending that or encouraging building owners to have grid flexible components in their building systems, perhaps a building automation system, that they participate in some kind of automated demand response program or something like that. But, you know, obviously we want to keep it kind of at a high level. So you can read some of the thoughts here that were captured during that meeting around how some of these programs don't exist yet, but we do want to acknowledge that. So I think the idea was that, again, our proposals will be fairly high level that we put forth for recommendations, in that we want to signal to the market and to the AQCC that these are important principles for them to consider and encourage demand flexibility. But maybe the market is not mature enough to actually have, you know, obviously have requirements or to really have concrete, I guess, yeah, requirements, or we don't exactly know how we would credit everything, but we do want to signal that these are important principles. And hopefully I've captured that somewhat correctly, but we can go to the next slide. And we tried to put together, again, some kind of broad language here that the task force could consider recommending. And so we wanted to open it up to discussion now. And again, we can wordsmith these. These were just kind of some comments and feedback that we heard during that last optional meeting.
Great, thank you, Kim. And so I'll just read the first one and then let you guys read the bullets at the end of the slide. And then if you guys have any thoughts or comments, we would love to hear them. So the task force recommends that the AQCC considers the benefits that grid interactive efficient buildings can provide and encourages the installation of GEB ready equipment. A couple of other options that we came up with is employing a building automation system with distributed energy resources and participating in an automated demand response program, integrating renewables and not fossil fuels for backup generation, incorporating storage, either thermal or electric, and vehicle to grid if they can discharge onto the grid during a demand event, and or meet a peak demand standard or demand response capability standard as defined by some green building certification standards. So any thoughts, or folks who were able to attend the optional meeting, any context or color you'd like to add to what Kim and I just shared? Joel.
I think our first bullet maybe is a little bit convoluted as I read it. I think a building automation system can be grid flexible, standalone. Distributed energy resources can be grid flexible, standalone. And I think the last statement there, integrating renewables and not fossil fuels for backup generation, I think really the intent there wasn't regarding backup generation, it was regarding grid generation. If we are leveraging grid flexibility to increase renewables on the grid, then that qualifies. The backup generation, I don't think was part of that.
Thanks, Joel. And just quickly, to make sure I'm understanding correctly, I think what we were recalling is, and this is a specific example, but we wouldn't want a building to turn off certain systems and then push those systems onto a natural gas generator or some generator that's burning fossil fuels in order to power the building during that demand event. So maybe we didn't capture that language correctly, but does that sound correct for what we had discussed?
Yeah, but I think when I brought up that issue, I was referring to the grid specifically, not backup generation. Backup generation would be on site if they're turning on a natural gas generator. Of course, we don't want that. I agree with that statement, but we also would like grid flexibility to increase renewables on the grid as a whole and not just substitute on-peak natural gas power for off-peak coal power on the grid, right? So I think a good summative statement for that is if these are leveraged for integrating renewables, we could even leave out reference to the fossil fuels altogether.
Okay.
And should we take out this with distributed energy resources? Maybe that doesn't, I think that was added in incorrectly.
I think that's an or statement, a building automation system or distributed energy resources and participate.
Okay.
At least as I see it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that I think that's right on, Joel, and that's kind of I might I don't know, to Katrina's earlier point, I might kind of wordsmith these bullet points a little bit differently, because I think that really there are three things that we want to convey. One is the technologies that we want to recommend, and I think they're kind of scattered throughout these. So I think that would be kind of this automation, so the BAS and the smart electric water heater controls, which maybe isn't quite mentioned, and managed EV charging stations and thermal storage. So I might put, the first bullet being encourage, GEB technologies. I think the second, and that could include kind of a list that we could continue to wordsmith. I think the second piece is intelligent operations, or it's how we use and deploy those technologies to support the ultimate goal. And I think that's around participating in demand response programs today and participating in ADR where available. And then I think the third bullet that I could see is like how we might choose to apply credit for these. And I think that is looking at, some kind of partial EUI credit for some of these technologies. And I also I want to step back, because this is really nuanced, and it is, as we talked about on the call, it's fairly forward facing, but this is really important, especially as we have more carbon-free electricity on the grid. When we use energy matters a lot. And so if we can shift our buildings loads to align with when we're generating electricity, both on-site and off-site, it's going to support overall system decarbonization at lower cost. And so I think we may want to convey some of that intent in our recommendation to the AQCC, like why this is important, and then create some kind of clear, crisp, kind of supporting statements. And I'm happy to continue wordsmithing this offline if that's easier. Thanks.
Thanks, Kara.
Thank you.
Joel.
Sorry, can I help a bit with the wordsmithing going on here?
Sure.
So I think the second bullet here, participate in an automated demand response program for the integration of renewable energy on the grid.
Sorry, Julia, I'll let you go. Getting excited.
Several editors. And then going back to the first bullet, I think we can include all of the technologies there. I like Kara's idea. So GEB technologies, comma, BAS. Water heating is not necessarily a grid interactive building technology. Some of them are just grid interactive water heaters. So I'd say BAS, water heating, V2G, DERs, and storage, electrical or thermal.
So Joel, should we add grid interactive before water heating or just remove water heating from that bullet?
Good question.
I think we should keep it if I could and add grid interactive water heating.
Okay.
It matters less in offices, but a lot in multifamily.
And I'm sorry, Joel, you said storage, electrical, or
thermal.
Thermal, thank you.
Which technically I would say water heating is thermal storage, but I mean, we can call it out separately. I think that covers all of the technology and really the intent of what we're trying to accomplish here. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel. Okay. Any other thoughts from task force participants? Do we like the two bullets Joel and Kara suggested? Any other items that we're missing or pieces to add to what we've included here? Okay. I'm not hearing any. Let's see, we got just a message from Katrina in the chat. Should we add language around where these programs are not already counted towards savings from statewide decarbonization of electricity and natural gas utilities to avoid double counting? That's a fantastic question, Katrina, and I'm going to put that back on the task force.
Wondering if maybe, I mean, we don't want any double counting anywhere in the system. Is there some kind of overarching statement that we could make that double counting is just not how you get there? I'm just afraid we'll forget it somewhere that it matters and we put it in everywhere else or something. So.
I guess I'm less concerned about double counting. It seems like that's a big issue, but when it comes to RECs, they're pretty tightly regulated. So double counting is not as easy as we seem to be implying. And I'm not aware of any demand response program being applied towards a statewide decarbonization effort. It's possible that it is, and maybe we want to cover the potential for a loophole there, but conventional demand response is really an economic argument. When prices are high, we reduce demand and there's an economic benefit there. I'm not sure that it's really considered as part of a decarbonization portfolio currently.
And it's just to my point that, you know, we don't know what's coming down the pike. Once people start innovating and the utilities start offering different programming to meet whatever, I just wanted to make sure it was kind of out there that these are not intended to overlap or double count in anywhere. I didn't even know what the right language is, but I guess I'm looking forward because there's so many things that have come along in my 40 years of working that, you know, I want to make sure that nothing sneaks in.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. John, I'll pass it to you.
Sorry about that. Forgive me, but this is still talking about alternative pathways. Is that correct?
This is, we have not started the discussion on alternative pathways. So this would be something that we could include as an alternative pathway, but it also could be something that could be considered towards core compliance.
Okay. Because just thoughts, I'm thinking out loud here, is the other discussion we had seem like alternative pathways if you can't meet the efficiency standards, where this would be, to me, everything on this list is part of getting to your 7% reduction by 2026. So that's why I'm wondering, we're still talking about partial credit on some of this stuff, but in reality this should just be what's being done, unless it's an alternative pathway, say they can't meet the original 7%. And maybe I'm just getting wound too tight in my head and I'm not understanding it completely. So.
No, thanks, John. I think that's a great point. From what I understand, the intent here is to, yes, we know that these things will help achieve the site EUI target, but do we want to add special circumstance or special consideration, knowing that these elements are something that we want to push building owners to do? And maybe there aren't building owners, thinking rural Colorado or smaller towns that really have these things top of mind.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thought from Katrina in the chat. I struggle with the first bullet because it's not, oh, we got a new one right as I was reading that. It's not outcomes focused, just about installing systems. And from Nori, can we help highlight that the energy efficiency measures blended with load flexibility, demand flexibility, response, storage, can shift peaks and be able to reduce utility costs. And that's why we want to support JEBs. So kind of back to creating a statement around the intent and what we're after with this sort of technology. And another from Katrina on the second bullet, I'd like to see credit, if given, be in proportion to the DR services provided to the grid. Okay. Well, these are all fantastic comments. I think what we should likely do is plan to take this discussion offline, and understanding that there's sort of three pieces that we want to talk about in Kara.
Okay.
Oh.
Signed up on my phone.
Sorry about that. And knowing that there are sort of three areas that we want to convey here. One, the intent around why we want this to support that, the shifting loads to renewables and away from fossil fuels on the grid, to identify the technologies that we want to encourage folks to pursue, and then that we want to encourage people to participate in those programs if and when they are available. So I guess general head nodding, are we okay to move this discussion offline and not vote on these principles today? So we have an opportunity to wordsmith them and figure those out in greater detail offline. And note that all of the comments and things that we've heard in the chat, we're capturing in the notes, and we'll make sure that when we bring these proposals back to you guys, or these ideas back to you guys, we're integrating these thoughts into them.
I just ask one process question. So we're making recommendations to the AQCC so they can draft regulations. And then who is the eventual implementer of those regulations? Because this strikes me as something like the Energized Denver Task Force made a lot of recommendations to us. Some of them went in our ordinance as law. Some of them are just things we are doing as we implement the ordinance. And it seems like this should be the implementer's job to encourage building owners to sign up for these programs because the economics on them are good and they're good for the grid. But I'm not sure there's actually a regulatory function for these programs. Maybe there is. Happy to have more discussion offline. But I just, can we make recommendations as the task force to how these things should be implemented? That's where like a lot of like the workforce stuff or equity stuff might fall, right? It's an equitable implementation. It's not a different regulation.
Yeah, I think that's fine, Katrina. Yeah, we recognize that this might not be, this is not going to be an eventual rule that, right, the AQCC can pass, but it is a signal that the task force wanted to recommend that these systems are, encouraged to be employed in buildings. And so, yeah, and the task force can make recommendations on how the eventual standard could be implemented as well. Again, no guarantees there, but Christine?
I was suspecting pessimistically that if we didn't figure out exactly how it would be done, the AQCC might not either, because we probably have a lot more collective expertise in this specifically than they do. And I'm okay with the concept, but I'm still not clear on exactly how directly it ties to greenhouse gas emission reductions. I don't know how we guarantee that what's being cut is, I don't know. I guess I still have some questions around that. Since this isn't my area of expertise.
Thanks, Christine. And Joel, I'll pass it to you.
I just want to go back to what Kara was saying, because I think it's very important. This really is the future. As we get to 80% plus renewables, the entire utility industry is going to be turned on its head. It used to be there'd be demand for electricity and we'd bring up supply to meet that demand. In a renewables future, we want to encourage a marketplace where the demand for electricity lines up with the supply of renewable energy. Currently, there's not really a market mechanism for doing that. And it's important, I think, through this that we begin to carve that out. So I don't want to see this go away.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Joel. Very well said.
Okay. Well, taking all of that into account, and thank you all for your comments and thoughts, let's move this discussion again offline. There's so much detail to cover here, and I really appreciate you guys being flexible with us as we try to navigate all of the detail and make sure we're capturing all of the intent here, because we, want to make sure that this recommendation is as fitting for our state and our goals and our trajectory for renewables as possible. So we will move this discussion offline. And what I'll bring us to next is, let me just move back into presentation. I'll skip through all the voting. So with the last 30 minutes, what we want to do is discuss alternative compliance. And this term has been mentioned a couple of times today. And so just thinking about, and the definitions in a couple slides. So thinking about how we're talking about this, alternative compliance in this case is options for buildings that demonstrate an inability to meet the EUI compliance requirements. And that can be the EUI compliance requirements plus the solar that they're enabled to use, plus the beneficial electrification credit, right? So keep that in mind, as those things we were talking about earlier are really geared at meeting the EUI compliance or allowing flexibility in that EUI compliance if they met that beneficial electrification load that we discussed. So this is looking at the small subset of buildings that are going to have some issue meeting the site EUI target, whether that be because they have financial hardship, whether that be because they have inherent characteristics of their building that make it really difficult for them to be more efficient. And so as we're thinking about alternative compliance options, we've heard throughout the process from you all that there are certain things that we should be acknowledging here and thinking about as we discuss alternate compliant options. That is that there's a large diversity of building types in this state. And so, we need alternative compliance options that support that diverse building stocks that we have, that we are supporting equity and providing flexible options for buildings that are under-resourced. And then really that we're providing flexibility for all buildings to meet the intent of this standard in this law. So in looking across the BPSs that currently, exist, most of the alternative compliance options are bucketed into two different buckets. We have an option to adjust the timeline or the date in which you need to be compliant. And then there's an option to adjust the target that you need to hit. So we'll talk about each one of these in turn. So looking at the timeline option first, typically we see in other building performance standards that this is really a pathway for under-resourced buildings. And most of the time it specifies that it's for not the final target, but one of the interim targets, one of the targets before you have to reach that final deadline. So reasons that buildings might go after alternative timelines are that it could be more effective to do efficiency upgrades at your building, if there's a major renovation planned, or if you have refinancing that's happening in the next few years. And so the timeline for what you're doing at your specific building doesn't necessarily line up great with the timeline for compliance in the building performance standard. We also usually see with an alternative timeline option, in order to request this option from the let's say in this example, the energy office, a building owner would need to submit a plan that articulates when the efficiency upgrades are going to happen, and how that new timeline is going to help them meet the final target. So that's what we usually see around alternative timelines. Thinking about alternative target adjustments. So a couple building types that might use this type of alternative option could be historic buildings that have really wacky systems or are difficult to maneuver around the existing building that's there. Data centers or hospitals are high energy users. So reasons buildings would go after this type of target if needed, right? This is only like if required, they would be going after these, is because of significant variations in operations, inherent characteristics of their building, the space, the infrastructure, how the building is set up, or if it's a high energy user and it is unable to meet the efficiency standards that are set. So typically, again, in building performance standards, in order to qualify for this option, a building owner would need to submit a proposed EUI target that is verified or based on an analysis or an energy model from a certified engineer that demonstrates that that proposed target is the maximum performance for efficiency that they're able to achieve, or from efficiency and renewables that they're able to achieve. So just a couple examples. I'm going to actually skip Denver and go to NYC and Boston. And then Katrina, I would love if you're available to share a little bit about how Denver is thinking through alternative compliance. So for New York City, an example of how they're thinking about a target adjustment is for healthcare facilities in the city. Those healthcare facilities can apply to have their target adjusted to 85% of their original target for the first target date they have. And then for the second target date they have, they can adjust their target to be 70% of the assigned target. And in New York, they use a greenhouse gas intensity metric, so it's slightly different than what we're considering here, but just an example to share. And then in Boston, alternative timelines and targets are based on hardship. So buildings first have to apply and showcase that they have some type of hardship. And in that case, then they are allowed to pursue an alternate timeline or an alternate target. And Katrina, there you are. Would you be willing to share how Denver thinks about the alternative compliance pathways, or how they've included them in the BPS?
Sure.
Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm also happy to share.
No, I'm happy to. So we do have these mechanisms for a building to adjust their final target due to inherent characteristics of the building. And we also have, and then we really, I suppose I would specify, really see that target adjustment being needed where portfolio manager doesn't already have the tools in place to set a benchmark for a property with certain attributes, like an indoor swimming pool, a 24-hour call center. So there's things that inherently don't fit well within sort of the portfolio manager system, where we might need to adjust the target. Those would be the simple ones. Then there's more complicated ones where, maybe a building just has a terrible envelope that's super leaky and it's really expensive to adjust it, and so inherently it's less efficient. That might require a larger engineering analysis to adjust the target. And then we've got the timeline adjustment, where if a building owner can save more energy by sort of waiting to do a project, say at the time when they already needed to replace a water heating or a space heating system, and that lets them get even more savings versus having to hit interim targets first. Then we allow for an adjusted timeline. so that building owners kind of can put together a plan for the time that works. Let's say they're planning a major renovation. There's a whole list of reasons why they might need to adjust their timeline. And so there's a lot of details to those that we are still working to flesh out. And so I'd actually love to think with this group about how, because we'd like our ordinance to sync up with where the state one goes, how over the next couple of months, if we finalize some of the details on that, we actually could work to make sure that this task force is recommending similar details if we can think through process on some of that together. So.
Great, thank you, Katrina. And then the hardship piece, I'm sorry, you mentioned that one as well.
That is not an exact term in our ordinance. I'm not sure what you're referring to there, but we do have a special call out, which is maybe what you're getting at, for affordable housing to adjust their timeline to align with when they refinance buildings, because they have particular capital constraints in the realm of affordable housing, where they only get access to capital at the time when they're refinancing. And so we would allow them to adjust their timeline to line up with when they're refinancing.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Katrina. That's awesome. So given all of these examples, you know, we again tried to put together some proposals, mostly again for the task force to react to. And we're hoping that this can spur a discussion with you guys. And we're not going to attempt to vote. Really, we're here for we have about 15 or so minutes left in the meeting. And so we're hoping we can just dive into discussion and hear your guys' thoughts about these alternative compliance options. But these are examples of how we could treat timeline or target adjustments. So I'll just read them and then I will open it up for discussion. So for timeline adjustment, the task force recommends that AQCC adopt an alternative compliance option that enables building owners to adjust the 2026 target deadline if it will support under-resourced buildings or other buildings in completing efficiency projects in line with other major planned capital improvement projects or refinancing. And then a target adjustment example is the task force recommends the AQCC adopt alternative compliance option that enables building owners to adjust their site EUI targets based on inherent characteristics of the building, significant variations in operations, or similar reasons. And Stacy, oh, I see your hand up. I'll pass it to you.
Hi, thanks. I had one comment, I guess, on the target adjustment. While I appreciate the intent of what you were suggesting, I just was thinking that it might be cheaper to pay the penalty than to go through the process you proposed to adjust my target. I don't know, I can't remember what the penalty is, but I don't want us to create an unintended consequence of just saying, yeah, if I got to hire a third party to develop a whole plan and scheme and blah, 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 I'll just pay the penalty and move on. That's no good.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. That's a great point. And Bill, thanks for your comment in the chat. How about a different measurement like power utilization effectiveness for data centers? So, Bill, we've heard this metric come up a few times, and I think we're curious if you have a recommendation or an idea on how we could apply this different measurement as an alternative compliance option within what we're discussing here.
And really, I'm curious too, how that would reduce energy use or demonstrate that the data center is reducing energy usage and emissions.
Well, power utilization effectiveness is total power divided by IT power. And so most data centers are at least 1.5 PUE. So for every megawatt of data center IT load, there's a half a megawatt of cooling to cool that data center. So if you could improve it 30%, you are effectively reducing its unit of energy used to support that load. So it's that particular one is widely accepted by the data center community, and it's the best you can do. If you have a world-class data center that's at 1.1, it should be given credit. So, yeah.
Thanks, Bill. And, if, let's say, for example, that data center is benchmarking and using Portfolio Manager to report their energy, would that efficiency gain in the power utilization effectiveness show up through the efficiency measured through Portfolio Manager or through that site EUI metric?
Energy Star score may improve. I would have to look at that and see if it does. Most data center operators look at their PUE, they try to drive it down. And the problem is, and I've said this before, the data centers, their use is not going down, it's going up. It's going up fast, it's doubling, it's tripling. Power densities are getting denser, but you are processing more data with the same amount of unit power, if you will. So it's almost like manufacturing. So, it's a fact of life. And so we have to have a way of dealing with it and driving people to improve performance somehow. So.
Okay.
In Denver, just to note how we're handling data centers, we are still figuring it out. We're going to be talking with data centers. We have another alternate compliance option that is specifically for manufacturing and agricultural users generally, because an EUI target is not appropriate for energy intensive process loads, which data centers fall under. So we're likely to sort of move data centers under that and figure out how to reach our targets for process load energy buildings separately. So the other thing I'll note here is, I think that these are the right general proposals. Look forward to hearing more from the group. I really think building owners need certainty on the details. So I would encourage that this be a space where the task force add more detail. Building owners, we're trying to get it to them as quickly as possible within our rules over the next couple months. I think they need certainty that the state will handle these things the same way, so that if they know they can adjust their target for the city, that they will also, have a similar mechanism to demonstrate why they would need an alternate timeline to the state and way of demonstrating that. And I think that the details on how you demonstrate these things matters a lot, and we will be figuring a lot of that out over the next couple months. So, and I think building owners would greatly appreciate if we sync up on that. There's a lot of angst from the uncertainty that our current language has for building owners today. We are trying to take uncertainty out of the market as quickly as we can.
And thanks, Katrina. Kathy is agreeing with your point in the chat, particularly for new potential owners. Any other thoughts from the group on these different options? If one's more applicable than the other? Nori.
Sorry, last point, but I think that's right. I mean, in my own mind, as interest rates are rising, I can see some of the projects, big projects that we had planned, we're going to push off until the rates are good because of access to capital. But some of these items for under-resourced buildings, we really want to encourage building owners, because they're ultimately going to help folks not have to move out because they can't pay a utility bill. So there was early in this process, someone had a comment about not passing these items on to the residents, and that nobody should receive an eviction because of any of this, or financial need rent assistance as a result of any of this. And I can't remember how we were going to handle that, but not passing this on to your tenants, but ensuring that we're encouraging owners to help benefit tenants with reduced utility bills was part of this alternate compliance option. Just can't. I guess those are my initial thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll pass it off to Kathy. Thanks, Nori.
Nori, thanks for your comment. I will say that unfortunately, building owners are going to, and investors are going to pass this on to their tenants, just like they do with any other expense. As much as we might want them to just do it because it's the right thing to do, it's also part of an ROI and a business plan, and they're responsible to their investors and bankers and whatnot. So I don't know if there's a way. I just think we need to be realistic that it unfortunately in a lot of cases will get passed on.
Thanks, Kathy. And Jenny, I saw your hand come up and then went down. Do you want to chime in?
No, this is the greatest, biggest concern I have out of all of this. Everything, every pit, every piece of this is expensive. As a building owner, no, you're not going to want to take on that full financial responsibility. As a smart business person, yes, you trickle out that cost somehow, some way. And unfortunately, low income housing tenants will get hit some direction. And man, it's already hard to make rent in Denver, much less pay for something else just because it's a good idea right now. You know what I mean? So again, I understand the whole concept. That's why I am here. But as the single mom in the room, holy cow, ouch, ouch. That's all I gotta say. I don't want to waste any time.
Thanks, Jenny. I really appreciate you sharing that. Katrina?
Yeah, I really share that sentiment, and I think that these options are the way we make sure that this law has the flexibility the building owners need to find the path to deliver improved energy performance, lower energy bills, healthier indoor air for their residents in a way that works for their plans for the building, so that these are, they can turn these requirements into projects that have sort of a good return and that end up being a good thing for tenants too. So I think these just have to be designed, like these are our option to really make sure it works for all buildings. I would, and we could, sort of figure this out in details offline, but we would welcome, as Denver works through the details of, we've got something in our rules and regs, but there's a lot of details of exactly what has to be submitted on this to get building owners certainty on how these alternate compliance options work. If this group was interested, we would welcome sort of a joint process to figure out some of these details where this group could participate on an optional basis, sort of like more optional meetings where we would run that all publicly and transparently anyway. If you all wanted to be at the table where we align on the details of like what has to be submitted, how it works, I think it would give building owners a lot more certainty, and that it's something where we have this opportunity because the timing syncs up to align. If there was interest.
Thanks, Katrina. We are getting close to time, so I want to make sure anybody has final, who wants to say anything else has a final chance to do so. There are a lot of comments coming in through the chat. I'm not going to read them all, but make sure you guys are noting these as they come through. And again, to Nori and Jenny's point, we will have carve out time. We hope in these task force meetings to discuss programs for compliance. And so something to be thinking about as an opportunity is maybe there's a chance to tie programs for financial support to some of these identification of these buildings that might have hardship. So just try to be thinking creatively about how some of these things could interact, and as we move forward, and we do hope to get to that conversation before our task force wraps up our discussions.
I was just going to jump in too and say that something that the task force could consider is making a broad recommendation that the state BPS align as much as possible with Denver's. in certain ways. And, then we can certainly dive into more details, but we could kind of make that recommendation. Again, nothing is going to be certain until the AQCC promulgates those rules. So we will lack, there is an element, unfortunately, of some uncertainty moving forward. But, again, we can, as the task force, certainly recommend that the AQCC move in that direction.
I see lots of heads nodding, which is great. I was going to mention just one other thing. I know it's not properly in our scope to set penalties, but because Stacy raised it, I wonder if also we might consider making a recommendation that the implementer of this or the AQCC take a look at what penalties would need to be to actually drive compliance, because I think that to the $2,000 annual penalty that was set in the underlying legislation will be cheaper than anything else. So this whole exercise is likely for naught, in my opinion, if we don't adjust that. And so we're doing a lot of study around exactly how to set Denver's fine schedule under the cap that our ordinance sets. I will have a lot of good data that could inform the AQCC on that, or the implementer on that. I know that would be a legislative change, but I think this task force could, we're sort of talking about like what's in our scope, like that's not properly, but like maybe it's something we'd want to touch on.
Thanks, Katrina. That's a great point. So with that, we have 3 minutes left. Are there any final comments from the task force on alternate compliance and some of these options we've presented today? And I apologize if you can hear the landscaping work going on behind me. Okay, well, I'm not hearing any. So in that case, I think, between meetings, as always, take some of these examples, be thinking about how they might apply, how you might want to see them applied, how we can be really thoughtful around under-resourced buildings and making sure that these adjustment options or alternate compliant options support those buildings and achieving our goals without undue burden. So lots to noodle on. There was a ton of great discussion today. And again, I just want to thank you all for being here, for being present, and for sharing all of your thoughts and ideas. So coming up next, we have our optional meeting number 2. That'll be May 11th from 1 to 2. We'll send out an agenda ahead of time. There is a lot we could cover in that optional meeting. And so we'll discuss offline what we want the focus of that meeting to be. And we'll share that out ahead of time. We hope you guys can make it. And then our next task force meeting 9 will be May 25th at the same time. Things we have to continue to discuss, wrapping up discussion around alternative compliance, demand flexibility, beneficial electrification, all the things we're discussed today, certainly, but new topics that we have yet to cover that we will want to make sure we're touching on as we move forward. Workforce and equity considerations, programs to support compliance. And then again, we hope to have an update on those public engagement meetings for you guys soon. So with that, Kim, I'll pass it off to you to wrap us up and sign us off.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time and have a great rest of your day. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions in the interim, of course.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Take care and have a great rest of your day.